Okay, hello everyone. I'm really pleased today to have Max Hartman joining us today to give some insight into his journey into the S&C field. I'm sure he'll give a bit more background about himself, but he's a S&C coach and rehab specialist as well, working out of MSC Performance in Birmingham. So Max, not to steal your thunder, but do you want to give the students a bit of a lowdown about you, your experience, and sort of how you got to where you are today?
Yeah, so it's probably a bit of a roundabout trip. I think I started off at uni in 2010. I was at UWE in Bristol, went like the sports therapy, sports rehab undergrad route, as I'm sure a lot of your like master students probably do as well. So sports therapy and rehabilitation course, which is 3 years, and then went straight into working in professional rugby. I did an internship over at Leicester Tigers, and I was there for a good couple of years. But that was very much in like the therapy realm in the medical department. Um, and when I was I sort of stayed there for a couple of years, splitting my time between pro sport, private practice, a load of youth sport, academy stuff, just trying to get experience basically. So loads of part-time gigs, loads of voluntary roles, loads of like cash in hand, get paid to work with one team on a Saturday, another team on a Sunday. Started my S&C Masters down at St Mary's in that time as well, which ended up doing part-time over, it was best part of 6 years by the end of the time I finished it. But um, yeah, worked a lot of like part-time gigs in the kind of therapy and rehab side of things, um, and gradually started to move my skill set more towards the S&C side of things. Gradually started to build my sort of philosophy on how I deal with clients, what I thought the best management practice was. Started using more principles of S&C as opposed to purely what I would consider sort of medical and therapy based modalities, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
Um, and gradually over the years, spent the first sort of 6 or 7 years out of undergrad working professional sport, splitting time between that and clinical stuff. So I worked with Leicester Tigers for a couple of years. I was down at Ealing in London for a year, and then moved into Coventry Rugby, where I started off in the medical department, again, running sort of the rehab stuff with the players. And by the time I left there, I was head of strength and conditioning, overseeing all the athletic development and all the athletic performance program. Um, and where I then moved over to MSC Performance. And now I'm just there full time in private practice, dealing with a caseload that is sort of half and half, essentially personal training, strength and conditioning clients,
Mhm.
but with sort of certain sort of history of injury. People have specific requirements as far as coaching, programming. So either people who might have had a surgery 10, 15 years
Yeah.
ago and just want to be in shape and want to train better. Marathon runners, triathletes who have a significant history of injury that need to sort of factor that into how they train versus more acute short-term injuries where someone might come in with a pulled hamstring and need 6 weeks of rehab, or someone might have an ACL reconstruction, need a year of early clinical rehab that then progresses into a full S&C program throughout the process. So bit of a roundabout sort of trip from
Yeah.
um, pro sport full time medical department type stuff to
Yeah.
private practice S&C almost full time.
Yeah. Nice. Yeah. Well, I think it'd be interesting to touch upon how you've actually set up your own business, and we'll probably touch on that in a bit. But first of all, you said you tend to lean towards or lean into the principles of S&C in terms of like the rehab side of things. Do you think that's where a lot of um, rehab specialists go wrong, or why have you sort of lent that way?
Yeah, for sure. And I think now, I think with S&C rehab and sports therapy courses kind of getting more and more popular. Like
Mm.
when I first went and did sports therapy back in 2010, there wasn't that many around. Whereas now, like you can rattle off like 15 unis off like first hand within 20 miles that all offer a sports therapy course. And I think now you're getting a lot more practitioners that have this kind of crossover between sports therapy, sports rehab, S&C, where actually from a principles based perspective,
Mm.
they're doing the right thing a lot more. Whereas I think actually, if you look back at people that did physiotherapy, went the NHS route, went physiotherapy a while ago, um, their formal education on exercise prescription, I think, is really, really lacking when you start dealing with people that want a high level of function.
Right, okay.
I feel like I've gone off topic a little bit on your original questioning, but yeah, I think a lot of so what you would call like rehab practitioners nowadays, a
Mm.
lot of people actually are getting better and better at that. Whereas I think your actual real clinical physiotherapists who might have been qualified for 10 years or so, who might have spent 9 of those 10 years in the NHS,
Yeah.
are a bit behind on the exercise prescription, the rehab principle side of things. But yeah, bringing sort of more traditional S&C based principles into rehab was just a game changer for me.
Yeah, nice. So do you think that people who aren't leaning into those principles are more focused on just dealing with the injury, but they're not looking to then improve performance or reach a certain performance goal? It's just about okay, managing that injury, but no better, basically.
Right, for sure, and like the NHS is very good for a lot of things in this country, and it's also very bad at a lot of things. But like, if you go to any kind of, whether you go to turn up at A&E on a Saturday afternoon after your football match and you think you've broken your leg, um, or if you go to a physio, if you get referred through your GP to physiotherapy, the
Yeah,
NHS is very good at making sure that you can get up and down the stairs and in and out of the bath. But it's not necessarily kitted out, and again, it shouldn't have to be.
yeah,
It's not necessarily kitted out or equipped to get you back to playing football, playing rugby, running track and field, that sort of thing. Never mind getting you back to more higher levels of performance than you were
yeah,
initially.
yeah,
Which in the private sector now, in private practice, there are, for a lot of people, there are services available where you could rupture your ACL. And before, for amateur footballers or amateur sportsmen, that was a death sentence for your career, basically going back 10, 15 years. Whereas now, with almost no input from the NHS, with no input to, support or funding, that sort of thing, these are amateur people with no support network
yeah,
around them as far as, a full-time medical department like you'd have at a football club. These people can get back in 9 months post-surgery as good as they were before. Like,
yeah,
that's doable. That happens all the time now, um, because there are those services available and there are private practitioners that can do that for you. Um,
yeah.
so yeah, we're in
Yeah.
a pretty good place in that perspective.
I guess it's a blessing, right? Because that's opened up a market for you to step in and provide that service, right?
Oh, mate, huge, massively so, and like the amount of, the amount of times that I work with other coaches, other PT, strength and conditioning coaches, and whatnot, who have an abundance of clients who want to train, who want to be in shape, who want to do these events, but are hamstrung by niggling little injuries or
Yeah,
old injuries, or you're right, what's in theory a really good training program, but so I can't do this because of my ankle, I can't do this because of my knee or whatnot. And it happens, or every gym up and down the country. There's coaches who are then referring out to other
yeah,
practitioners like myself.
yeah,
Um, so this person can't do the program. Can we have some input on it? Um, well, as well as anyone
yeah,
that's
yeah,
happening everywhere. Like,
yeah,
so like being grounded in that rehab, being in that sort of niche space, yeah, really opens up opportunities for you.
Do you think like looking 10 years ahead, the NHS or like the um how would you classify it as um that sort of physiotherapy space will lean into those principles more? Do you think it's
I
just a
think
case of, it's a
it,
case of it just
yeah, it's
catching
definitely
up?
value. There's certain, well, there's definitely from an NHS perspective, they should be. You're
Yeah,
starting to see more job adverts now for sports therapists or like what they call, I can't remember how they label it, like musculoskeletal practitioners.
okay,
Or there are certain NHS trusts in the UK that are hiring like rehab specialists or strength and
yeah,
conditioning specialists, because they realise that actually probably putting someone through maybe 3 or 4 months of conservative rehab where they get them in a gym doing leg extensions and deadlifts is a hell of a lot cheaper than doing a meniscectomy, or it's a hell of a lot cheaper than doing a
yeah,
joint replacement for certain people.
yeah,
And this kind of preventative medicine space is huge from an NHS perspective, but also you look at it from the very other end of things. There's a couple of companies that are appealing to like the very highest level of market. There's a company called Hintzer based out
okay,
in, I want to say, Switzerland, where their whole like niche is putting what they would call a performance coach in with their whole niche is what they call like Formula One and Fortune 500. So like you'd have one practitioner that might travel with Lewis Hamilton for a season,
yeah,
or that might travel with, I don't know, a super high flying businessman for a season who is a physiotherapist, personal trainer, um, life coach, and strength and conditioning practitioner kind of rolled into one.
oh
So
wow,
you see
okay,
them from a, and they travel with that person, and the whole idea is that you're you're helping them stay in shape physically, mentally. You're impacting areas of life like food and nutrition. You're improving their sleep so that, if they're a businessman, they can do better at work. If they're a Formula One driver, they're looked after from top to toe the whole year round. And I think when you've got like the public sector and the NHS having a big motivating factor to save a huge amount of money by keeping people healthy and keeping people out of the operating room, and
Yeah.
then at the other end of things, you've got people that have a real motivation for high paying jobs to be trained in multiple fields and to be able to do the kind of the rehab, hands-on treatment, S&C, kind of all of that rolled into one. When you've got practitioners at both ends of the extremes there that are motivated to pick up these skill sets, and you're going to see it more and more for
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah. Nice. Um, so you thought that now you're working with sort of general population who've got like athletic pursuits, but maybe dealing with injuries. What sort of the common misconception have you found with strength training or the sort of rehab process that maybe the majority of people have?
So there's a couple. As where do you start? There's a couple in particular. So like the especially like working in a city centre facility, you got a lot of people who are um, sort of like white collar professionals,
Yeah.
bankers, lawyers, finance, tech, that sort of thing, recruitment consultants, that sort of thing, they will often, there'll be runners, crossfitters, they'll maybe not crossfitters so much as there's a lot of that, but they're not necessarily the population I'm talking about. Runners, cyclists, triathletes, high rocks is a big one now, which is getting more popular, who are all about the conditioning side of things. They're all about being able to go out on their long run on a Saturday, being able to do a long bike ride on a Saturday, doing a triathlon session, whatever it might be.
Yeah.
Um, and they don't want to be sore for it. They don't want their legs to be heavy. They don't want to be tired, so they don't do their strength training in the week. Um, but they're also probably the kind of people who historically their idea of going to the gym would be back day, leg
Yeah.
day, arm day, chest day, that sort of thing. So when you ask them, why their legs are sore and why that's put them off lifting weights and then going into doing a long run on Saturday, is because their idea of a lower body strength training session is like 5 sets of leg presses, five
Yeah.
sets of leg extensions, hamstring curls, squats, walking lunges, and they just
And then
totally.
taxi home 'cause you can't walk.
Yeah, exactly. It's they've read a Men's Health 10 years ago, done a bodybuilding split that Jay
Yeah.
Cutler used or something, and they've tried to apply that to their strength and conditioning, and it just couldn't be further from it. So
Yeah.
the big thing that the real misconception, especially with like endurance athletes, is that weight training will either make you sore and tired, or more likely to injure yourself, or it will make you heavy and slow.
Yeah.
Um, and obviously, we know from an S&C perspective, the whole point of strength and conditioning is developing capacities and outputs specific to your chosen sport so that you are more robust and capable of sustaining higher outputs for longer relative to your given pursuit. Um, so yeah, soreness and fatigue and stress, and people don't want to get big and slow.
Yeah.
Um, is a kind of big one. And then people's idea of, especially in my field, the other big thing I see is like people's idea of what constitutes, whatever you want to call it, rehab, prehab, injury prevention, or like rehab type exercises. People are very quick to think they need glute activation drills, um, and very quick to say they don't want to lift weights because they're not ready for it, because they haven't optimized where their glutes are firing, or they
Yeah.
haven't sorted out their dorsiflexion or their squat. They can't squat properly or whatever it is, and they need to perfect this one thing first before they go near a dumbbell.
Yeah.
Um, which just couldn't be further from the truth. The first thing that I often get people to do in that scenario, someone comes in with a history of injury. I've got one client in particular, very good marathon runner, has been doing marathons he only restarted like 6 or 7 years ago, but he's gone to the point where he's running like a 2:40 marathon. Had never sort of strength trained before we started working together. And he came in and he'd had hamstring injuries, groin pain, adductor problems, Achilles tendinopathies, pulled his calf, like repeated soft tissue injuries, all lower limb.
Yeah.
And the first thing we said was like, right, we need to just do some basic strength training on your lower body, anywhere from 1 to 2 times a week for a consistent period of time. And 60% of this stuff will clear itself up like that, and it's
Yeah.
gone. Which he very much has done. He still gets niggles because he runs 50 miles a week, don't get me wrong. But the first thing we need to do is just start building some element of capacity, some element of tolerance. Whereas that same person, again, like great bloke, I won't speak badly of him, but he was fixated on the fact he had to activate his glutes first. Everything was coming down to the fact that glutes aren't firing. I haven't got enough dorsiflexion. When I squat, I shift to the left. I'm like, I literally don't care about any of that. Let's just get you to
Oh, I'm actually frozen.
become the 1%
So,
at the very end of the curve.
just say that last bit again, mate. You just froze.
So I just said like all the the perceived issues that you had about his squat shifting to the
Yeah,
left or the right, his glutes not firing, his dorsiflexion. I said I literally just don't care about any of that. I'd much rather see you just get some basic capacity across the lower limb, some strength base, and then all of those little things that you spoke about might become the 1% factors at the very end of the curve, or like the very the cherry on top if you really want extra work to do. But the base strength comes from squatting, deadlifting,
yeah.
um, single leg work like 2 to 3 times a week at most, and doing it in sensible doses for the next year, and then there we
So,
go.
so yeah, I sort of okay. Your squat might not look perfect, but
Mhm.
what does it look like? And then let's get strong like that. In
Yeah, exactly. And there's one thing that I like. I often try and say to people that is, I think it was a William Wayland quote, powering through down in Essex. Like until you are regularly strength training, and until
Mm,
you have some base strength and base capacity, all those other details, all you're doing is trying to optimize a system that is just inherently fragile.
yeah,
Like you're trying to make something perfectly symmetrical when its actual capacity to deal with any sort of load is just next to zero. So you can have the ugliest squat in the world, but if you're leg pressing a couple of times a week, doing as a runner in particular, leg pressing a couple of times a week, doing some hamstring curls, some leg extensions, some Copenhagen's, your squat could look awful. I don't really care,
yeah,
because at the very most, strength training is general prep. Your squat doesn't have to look perfect for you to be able to run really well.
yeah,
We're talking about some athletes that are outputting really, really good numbers, whether they're endurance cycling, whether they're marathon running, but they think they're fragile because their squat's not symmetrical. When it has absolutely no bearing on their running performance. What does is the fact that they've got no tissue tolerance, the fact that they've got no general strength, they've got no sort of capacity through triple extension. Um, there's definitely things that come into it as far as certain joint ranges of motion we need to be able to access, certain sort of certain patterns need to look at least relatively good because they kind of give us an inkling as to what's going on a muscular level at individual joints or individual muscle groups or whatnot. But yeah, until we actually get some base strength through, until you're strength training 2 times a week, you're trying to optimize a system that's just inherently fragile and has no tolerance anyway.
yeah. And also go back to that example you said. He's running 50 miles a week, so time is a limiting factor for him. So if he's spending 25% of his training trying to activate something, that
Yeah,
could be time
exactly,
spent
exactly.
better
Like I say, I
spent.
mean, you can activate your glutes as much as you want, but if there's just, if your glutes are flat as a pancake,
Yeah,
if you've just got no
nothing to activate.
yeah, exactly,
Yeah, yeah,
exactly that. And
yeah,
people they get paralyzed in the details, and they think, oh, I can't start. I know I need to start strength training, but I can't do it yet because I don't feel my glutes. I'm like, well, I'm not surprised you don't feel your glutes because the heaviest weight you lift is like 3 kilos.
yeah. Exactly.
Why would you? Yeah. So
Yeah,
um, that I'd say, so that kind of the soreness and fatigue on one hand, and then the kind of the real details that people look at. It's those kind of things that are the real big misconceptions that as soon as we start doing any sort of strength training, people almost have like this light bulb moment of like, oh, I see what we're doing now.
yeah.
Um, so yeah, those are probably two of the biggest things I'd say.
Nice, mate. So quick one about how maybe your process is affected by literature or sort of evidence. Um, Obviously, you keep up to date with what's going on in the world, but how much of that does actually influence your programming or exercise selection or whatever it may be, or do you just sort of take it with a pinch of salt or save it on, put it on the back burner,
Uh,
maybe relate to it?
I think you probably, when you're purely from an S&C perspective, if someone came in and just said, I want to run faster or jump higher, or I want to be better at this given sport. Obviously, everything always starts with a needs analysis.
Yeah,
You're rolling through, what qualities, what capacities, what outputs they have to be able to do, what are the time frames, what are the kinetic and kinematic demands of their given sport. Um, and then you're reverse engineering your program from that. That's your basic sort of
yeah,
S&C process 101, isn't it? When you start talking about someone who has a significant history of injury, for example, you're then starting to really factor in, okay, what is the injury they've had? So if they've had an ACL in the past, if they've got recurrent hamstring strains, that sort of thing, part of your needs analysis isn't necessarily um, sport specific, but is injury specific. So we know there are certain qualities for pretty much every injury that are well documented within the literature that are predisposing factors to someone sustaining that injury. So again, I spoke about sort of certain joint ranges of motion and certain joint positions. For a lot of like hip and groin issues, for adductor strains and tears, that sort of thing, we know reduced hip internal rotation can be a predisposing factor for hip and groin injuries. So we need to screen for that. We
Okay.
know adductor strength is a pretty significant risk factor for that. So we need to screen for adductor strength or capacity, particularly like from an eccentric perspective. We know that hip extension, peak force, hip extension strength is a pretty big factor. So we need to screen and test for that as well. So as opposed to just looking at demands of the sport, you're
Yeah.
looking at what their history of injury is, what the predisposing factors to that injury are, and how they impact someone. So um, obviously for all of that, you've got to have a real good understanding of the current evidence base. If you go far enough back in, so again, I keep going to the idea of like ACLs and whatnot. If you go far enough back into the literature, um, there's a massive movement, sort of probably when I was at university and beforehand, that a big risk factor for knee injuries was if someone was like quad dominant, if they didn't have enough hamstring strength.
Yeah.
Whereas actually now it's come full circle. We know that the biggest single thing you can do to reduce the incidence of ACL injury and a lot of like patellofemoral problems or knee issues is just pure knee extension strength. So we've gone from doing
Okay.
all this like functional work, loads of hamstring type conditioning, to like the first thing you want to do when you get someone fresh out of an ACL operation is get them a leg extension machine, because we know that like quad strength and knee extension is the biggest thing. So the evidence does change.
Yeah.
You've probably seen things come full circle from a fashion perspective
Yeah.
in the strength and conditioning realm. You see things kind of come in and out of fashion all the time, and people
Yeah.
change their mind in literature. But the evidence does change, and the evidence does actually that does sort of move on sometimes as well. That's probably one big example of it. But when you're looking at your needs analysis, a lot of my client base in particular, it's looking at those predisposing factors and then training to minimise those alongside the actual performance demands as well.
Yeah. So if you've got, let's say you've got someone who doesn't play a sport, they just want to come in and just, general train, do some general training, you'd screen for sort of what their injury risks, or like how would you,
Uh,
put a
so
framework around it, if that makes
if
sense?
someone is a pure like a personal training client,
Yeah.
I'd always ask them, if they had any injuries in the past,
Okay.
and of course it depends on what someone wants to do and what their idea of function is. Because if you try to think of the best way of describing it, so if you were to um, if you had a significant hamstring tear, if you were a runner and you had a hamstring tear,
Yeah.
one of the very early things that we need to get you back doing to rehab that hamstring is just basic strength training. So it's one of the very first steps in the process of rehabbing. Again, a more complex sports probably more. So football or rugby, one of the first things that player will do after a hamstring tear is get back in the gym and start lifting weights.
Mm.
That then moves into explosive work, so plyos, jumps. You then get into low level running, sprinting, change of direction, etc., etc., and it gets more and more complex and more sport specific. So if we have someone come in and their goal is just to get in shape, and all we need to get them to do is lift weights, it's not that much of a complex rehab. So if someone turns around and says, I've torn my hamstring a couple of times, I've had an ACL operation 10 years ago, or I've got some shoulder pain when I bench, like getting them to the point where they can lift weights is a pretty short process, really, because all you do is just scale those weights. I'm not having someone come in the gym and do 1 rep maxes day one anyway.
Yeah.
So to get someone who's had a hamstring tear to the point where they can do RDLs and split squats, it's not a long process.
Mhm.
Um, but if they turn around and say, I want to lift weights so that I can get back to playing rugby, that's a different
Yeah. Different
conversation.
question.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and that's a full rehab process. So um, generally speaking, if someone comes in the gym and they're a Gen Pop client, um, I'm not putting them through a huge screening process. I'm not putting them through a huge testing battery, because for most Gen Pop clients, I'm going to do some sort of like bodybuilding, hypertrophy oriented type program.
Yeah.
So it's not the most complex movement patterns. It's not the most challenging skill type exercises. It's a lot of machine based work. It's a lot of bilateral work. It's a lot of fixed single plane work. Um, I want to be aware if they've had past injuries, so that
Yeah.
A, I don't take that, and B, actually, if it's something that bothers them on a day to day basis, I want to be working on it to some extent. So it might be that if they've got that nagging shoulder pain when they bench, we're doing a bit of rotator cuff work and we
Yeah.
make sure we have some lateral raises in there. So we're working on it.
Yeah.
But ultimately, that kind of body composition, gen pop training type program, I know in my head roughly what I'm going to do before they come in. And I'm just screening the patterns I want to load. I want them to do push, pull, squat, hinge, maybe some carries, maybe some bracing, maybe some single leg stuff. So let's get them in, do a push, pull, squat, hinge, see how they move, see how they tolerate it, see what their skills like, and then choose things that fit into those categories appropriately. If someone's got a really good basis of movement and they're pretty mobile and they've got an understanding of how to work around a barbell,
Yeah.
that push pull squat hinge might be a bench press, a chin up, a back squat, and an RDL. If they've got none of those qualities and they don't understand any of that, it might be a leg press, a chest press machine, a lat pull down, and a hip thrust.
Yeah.
So it's you're improving or well increasing or decreasing the skill demands um, and the potency of those exercises based on what their current capacity and movement quality is like. But
Well,
essentially, go on.
guys,
Sorry.
when would you then switch to? Would you always keep him on that, or would you then say, right, after
No,
for example, switch to free weights?
so it might be that a lot of times. So, recent example, I've started coaching a really good friend of mine who has like almost zero basis of like physical training experience. Never been in the gym, had really bad problems with back pain, scoliosis, shoulder pain, neck pain from like an office job. So we started him off doing it was just an isometric hip thrust, almost treating his hip thrust like a plank, holding it at the top, a little bit of band of resistance across his waist, and that was his hinge pattern. But in his warm ups, he was doing some cat camels, he was doing some pelvic tilt exercises, so that by 3 or 4 weeks in, just by spending 5 or 10 minutes on it in a warm up, he understand what a hip hinge looked and felt like, and we
Mhm.
could progress that isometric hip thrust into actual hip thrust up and down. And then
Okay.
he's at the point now where he gets more and more familiar with that exercise, and he's now at the point where he's doing RDLs, safety bar good mornings, trap bar deadlifts, because he understands what it looks and feels like to move his hips and his pelvis and put tension onto his hamstrings. Whereas day one, I said, let's just look at a trap bar, and it was all just upper back rounded out, looked all nasty,
Yeah.
had no idea what the hip hinge should look like. So you use your again because you're not getting someone warming up to the point where they can sprint and do contact type drills and whatnot. All they've got to do is warm up to the point where they can move a light barbell. A lot of times,
Yeah.
start off with, we'll do a light leg press. Your movement prep can be very like quite conscious, quite skill based, where you're actually teaching them the fundamentals of different movement patterns and you're upskilling them. So they
Yeah.
might come into the gym being able to do 3 or 4 movements that are really, really basic and really low level, and they might spend the first 4 weeks doing that, and you're spending warm up time actually teaching them how to do more complex things. They might only be able to do a hand supporting split squat or a leg press as their squat pattern, but
Yeah.
in your warm ups, you're doing hip turnovers, figure fours to the point where they can do some sort of basic goblet squat. And after
Okay.
a few weeks, that goblet squat becomes their squat pattern. And after a few more weeks, safety bar squat becomes their squat pattern because you can just work on these things
Yeah.
as you go. So
So
you're
that's that.
constantly doing new movements without detracting from the quality of the session in the short term. They can get a stimulus from day one, but they're always learning the next thing.
So that's always your end goal is to get them on the barbell, get them on the trap bar, whatever it is.
Yeah, and you might not need it, but if
Yeah.
someone's going to train, and ultimately what we're in the business of doing is trying to build habits that where people are going to train for months, years,
Yeah.
decades, ideally, um, they're not going to want to just leg press for the next 20 years and
Yeah.
that be their only lower body movement. So if you can get someone to the point where they can squat, leg press, trap bar, split squat, Bulgarian, great because you've got the option of movement variability in there. Um, and then over the years, that allows them to always have some sort of novel stimulus coming in so that they can keep progressing. If someone can just leg press and they never learn after hip hinge, they're actually putting themselves at risk of injury there because training monotony is a very real thing and it is a very real factor, predisposing factor for certain injuries. But also as well, the effort they're going to have to put in to keep progressing that for 10 years
Yeah.
without any sort of assistance work is, and to actually stay interested is really limited. So,
Yeah.
um, the more sort of options we can give people, we're making them more robust by doing that anyway, because they can experience more movement variability, but you're allowing them to probably accumulate more quality training over a longer period of time.
Right.
Um, there's also certain exercises that are just more potent stimulus. So like if someone can only do, in the case of my friend that I'm coaching now, if he can only ever do a hip thrust with bands across his waist as a resistance, he's not going to be fully training. Like we said before about rehab exercises, he's not going to get in really big, robust stimulus across the hip extensors.
Yeah.
Whereas if he gets to the point where he can move well enough to do heavy RDLs, heavy deadlifts, and whatnot, he's got the opportunity to experience a much more robust stimulus in the long run.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, so it sounds like you've got a really like clear system, like systematic approach to anyone who walks through the door, right? But what's maybe one thing you've changed your mind on, maybe recently or over the course of your career, about training, strength training, conditioning, whatever it could
Uh,
be?
and again, I'll probably go back to um, what I said about sort of applying principles of sort of rehab versus principles of strength and conditioning. I think I've massively reduced what I think is the importance of variability. I think someone's got to have, the ability to cycle through different movements in the gym. And they've got to have the ability to sub things. If they squat for 6 weeks and they hit a plateau, you've got to be able to swap that for something else.
Okay.
Um, but I think early on, especially in a lot of rehab circles and where we were saying a lot of like physiotherapy practitioners maybe go wrong at times, is that they really overemphasize the importance of movement variability over like just having an exercise that someone is good at that you can progressively overload for 6, 8, 12, 16 weeks at a time.
Mm-hmm.
um, we're trying to get people to adapt on a physiological level, not just practice skills.
Yeah.
um, I think and that can apply to Gen Pop clients as well as in sport. In sport, you want the reason for progressive overload and the reason for actual relative small amounts of variation in a strength and conditioning program is in the gym. A lot of what we do is at best general. So
Mm-hmm.
we just need progressive overload in the gym. They get all the movement variability they need from what they do on the pitch because it is, or when they're running or when they're playing on court, that sort of thing. If you're playing racket sports, field sports, the movement variability they're going to experience in the games and in their training is almost unlimited. So we're not trying to replicate that in the gym. All we're trying to do is get some semblance of progressive overload and some physiological adaptation. And then for Gen Pop clients, like I say, whether you're looking at someone who wants to look better in the mirror,
Mm-hmm.
lose weight, or live a longer, better life, again, they're still just interested in progressive overload.
Yeah.
If you want someone to gain some muscle, lose some fat, they need progressive overload, they need high tension, they need bodybuilding type stuff. If we want someone to be fitter and healthier so they've got a better quality of life at 65 or 70, again, it comes in the form of progressive overload because more muscle mass, less body fat leads to longer life expectancy, higher VO2 max leads to longer life expectancy, quality of life, etc., etc., etc. And that all comes from just good quality basics done well and progressively overloaded for a long period of time. So, um, like I said, I think the rehab field in general, because you have athletes who are taken out of their sports participation, you can fill that gap with more variability over time because someone who's used to running around on the pitch and getting variability all day, every day, fine. They
Yeah.
get that from that. Once they're injured and they come um, into sort of an off feet position, or not being able to run around or play or train for 6 or 8 weeks at a time, part of the rehab process to some extent can be giving that movement variability in the gym and exposing them to a lot of different types of training in the rehab field, which is fine.
Yeah.
But we don't need to then project that onto Gen Pop clients and fit and healthy athletes as well.
Yeah, because they're already, like you say, already getting that from their sports. Yeah, nice. Right, Max, I appreciate your time, and Zoom is about to kick us out. But I've got one last question.
Yeah.
Have you got any book recommendations or resource recommendations, podcasts, websites, whatever it is, that our students
Uh,
you might find really useful, or
uh,
they might find useful?
the high performance handbook. I can't remember exactly. That was a really big one for me. But I think it's Dan Howells or
Okay,
Dan Lewindon. Dan Lewindon came
what's
out
it
with the
called?
high.
High performance handbook.
Think it's a high performance handbook, which Dan Lewin, and that's a really, really good starting point. If
Okay,
I've said it wrong, I will send you the link afterwards. So I'm sure you can attach it to this.
yeah,
That's a massive one. Online, Pacey Performance,
yeah,
Stronger by Science. If you're interested in like training, coaching Gen Pop clients, Mike Israel, Renaissance
mm,
Periodization, as from a hypertrophy perspective, is the man. Yeah, so anything sort of Renaissance Periodization. Um, from a hypertrophy perspective is kind of where I normally go for my approach to like Gen Pop clients.
Yeah.
And yeah, if you can tolerate the spicy social media, Kia went and flat from a sort of rugby and on pitch, and to some extent nowadays a business perspective as well.
Yeah.
Kia went and flat rugby strength coach is the guy in that area. But yeah, the list almost endless. You know, the amount of information that's flying around online now is massive.
Yeah.
With that comes its drawbacks. You know, you don't want to be listening to charlatans and
Yeah.
filling your head with rubbish. But anything but Joel Seedman.
Yeah. We didn't even get onto running your own business, so we might have to make a part two, Max.
Yeah, man,
That's all right.
100% for sure,
Yeah, we'll
for
try and
sure.
get you on next week, maybe, or sometime soon. But yeah, I appreciate your time, mate, and thanks again. And hopefully the students found this helpful.
Top man, thanks for
Cheers,
having
mate.
me. Part two soon.
See you in a bit.